Chapter 237, back with another review. And this review is kind of similar to my last video, which was of the 2007 film Teeth, which I think was made to look and feel kind of like a classic B horror movie. And it's actually a horror comedy where a lot of the comedy lies is not just the absurdity of the premise, but a lot of the tropes of like a classic small town, something weird happening, uh, B movies of like, the 50s and 60s. And I think it did a very good job with it. This one is quite similar, but this one mixes horror, sci-fi, and this one this one is full on more over the top comedy, whereas I think Teeth was more of a comedy, just kind of how it almost parodies itself or parodies what it's doing. Here, though, it's a straight up horror comedy. Like, you know, uh, Dead Alive or Return of the Living Dead. Not comedy horror, which is different. That's like Shaun of the Dead and Zombieland. Um, but came out around the same time, a year earlier, 2006, by James Gunn, actually. And it is his film Slither, which I remember when this came out. I remember seeing the trailers. I remember seeing it at the video store. And for whatever reason, I never felt like watching it. It wasn't until some years later, probably 5, 6 years later, I actually saw it and had a lot of fun with it. This is one I go back to every so often, and every time I do, I still enjoy it. I laugh. I laugh quite a bit, actually. Uh, I would say this has more jokes and gags than Teeth. And people can say what they want about James Gunn. I know he got in trouble, but I know he had a lot of supporters as well. Prior to this, he wrote the Dawn of the Dead remake with Zack Snyder. And then before that, he worked with Troma, which there's a couple Troma nods in here. Lloyd Kaufman has a cameo. And this is actually a lot like Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon, even Friday the 13th Part 6, where there's just a bunch of Easter eggs to other horror films, um, which I'll get to. But it also has a great cast. You got Nathan Fillion, who, if I'm not mistaken, his voice career as Green Lantern is pretty much considered like what Kevin Conroy is to Batman, like the great Green Lantern voice. I could be wrong about that. Um, Elizabeth Banks, Greg Henry, who I'm a big fan of. I always think of him in the slasher film Just Before Dawn. He had his supporting role in Raising Cain. And of course, the wonderful Michael Rooker, who's great in everything. But I always think of Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer. I think of his. I'm trying to think of the right adjective, but his role in Mallrats. Always love Michael Rooker. Yeah, music by Tyler Bates, who did the music for the Dawn of the Dead remake, and written and directed by James Gunn. Which I thought Kaufman had a hand in producing it, but I guess he didn't. Now, when this came out, one, it bombed. It didn't even make back its budget. But it received good reviews, and it's sort of become a cult film of the 2000s. It has an 87 on Rotten Tomatoes. Um, it Some people have theorized that one, many people thought it was just a remake of the 80s film Night of the Creeps, because it involves alien slugs getting inside you, getting inside your brain, and turning you into a zombie. Apparently, James Gunn had said he hadn't seen Night of the Creeps. Uh, his main influences, well, this is a throwback to 80s horror films. But also to finish up that first thought, also some critics believe that at the time there just wasn't a lot of horror comedies, so maybe people weren't quite ready for it and they weren't ready for all the humor that's in it. Could be. I can't really say it's because people thought it was a remake of Night of the Creeps, because this was at the height of just the boom of remakes from 2003 Chainsaw Massacre on, and they always made money. So I don't think it's because people thought it was a remake. But James Gunn went on to say that Cronenberg's Shivers and Cronenberg's The Brood were his top two influences. But even if he was influenced by Night of the Creeps, and that in itself is kind of an homage to, and what I always think of when I think of Slither, 50s sci-fi horror B movie. Uh, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Blob, small town, kind of in the middle of nowhere. This takes place in South Carolina. That's just overtaken by some alien force. And yeah, it's goofy, it's silly. It does have a lot of the same tropes. Eventually, the Blob in the 80s version. Notice how I didn't say remake, because remakes before 2003, I think, are versions. They're different than remakes post 2003. But we need to make a video about that. Also The Fly. He was very influenced by David Cronenberg's The Fly. They all pay a lot of homage to those 50s sci-fi horror B movies. As does Tremors. There's also nods to Tremors. I mean, there's a whole list of nods. I mean, there's, well, excuse me. First, just a quick summary. A comet crashes to Earth in this small town, of Wheelsy, South Carolina. One guy, Grant, played by Rooker, he happens to come across it. This blob shoots an arrow into him that goes up into his brain. He becomes infected, and he becomes the host of this alien that will impregnate some other host. They'll give birth to a swarm of these slugs, which will get into people's brains through their mouth, become a collective conscience, and pretty much take over the planet. And it's up to Grant's wife, played by Elizabeth Banks, the town sheriff, played by Nathan Fillion. Those are our three leads, and some of the townspeople to save the day. Figure out what's going on and save the day. But apart from that, I mean, there's a couple of shots throughout the town where you see a sign of R.J. McCready's, I think it's Antiques. R.J. McCready is Kurt Russell in John Carpenter's The Thing. Greg Henry, the mayor, plays Jack McCready, which I think is a mix of Kurt Russell in The Thing and Big Trouble in Little China. There's a store called Max Ren something. That's James Woods from Videodrome. Also, when Rooker is first infected with this parasite, he has an insane hunger for meat. And not only does he go to the store to buy meat, but he buys Brundle's meat. It's the brand name, which is Brundle was Jeff Goldblum's name in The Fly. He keeps repeating the word meat whenever he sees it, kind of like Bud the Chud. Of course, Night of the Creeps. I don't know if this is a exact reference, but Grant's final form, when he's done transforming, or as far as we see him get, is very similar to the Stuart Gordon film From Beyond. I believe it was Stuart Gordon. I know it was a Lovecraft film, but Um, I just have to check it real quick because I know he was still recording. Yeah, see, I was right. Um, and God, I mean, there's characters named after some of the characters in Dawn of the Dead. There's the school, Earl Bassett School, is named after Fred Ward in Tremors. There's a diner called Meg Penny's Diner, which is from the Blob remake or 80s version of the Blob. Uh, when Grant is pretty much this giant slug monster and he's been found out and he's hiding before the slugs come out, he's going around killing all these farm animals. And they go out to the Castavets farm. Castavets is a reference to the coven the coven leader neighbors of Mia Farrow in Rosemary's Baby. One of the slugs gets into this girl's mouth. She's able to take it out, but while it's in there trying to get into her brain, she can see into its life and its life on, past lives and past versions, which is similar to Catermass in the Pit, which is actually from the 60s. Also, Nightmare on Elm Street, because you have this scene where the slug is swimming towards her. It's even the same shot, looking long ways, sort of face level with the bathtub. And yeah, there's just a ton of references. There's when the parasite first lands on Earth, it's kind of like the of Evil Dead Cam going through the woods. And I'm pretty sure the theme song to Predator is played at least once. Yeah, I made a whole list because I wanted to make sure I got all of them, and maybe I didn't. But anyway, so those are just some of the references. Now, oh, also you get appearances by, oh, I keep stopping myself. The one woman, because when Grant's condition is getting worse, he doesn't want to hurt Elizabeth Banks, so he goes after this other a woman in town, and he's got these two huge tentacles, uh, which is similar also to From Beyond, also also Rabid, which is a Cronenberg film. Sticking to her, they make her pregnant with the worms, and he has to bring her meat. And then that was the one thing I remember from the trailer is just like this giant. Think of like the blueberry girl from Tim Burton's version of Chocolate Factory. She looks like that. And she's like, something's wrong with me. And of course, she just rips and all the slugs come out. But when he first goes to her house, she's watching Toxic Avenger. Pam from The Office is also in it, which she was actually James Gunn's wife at the time. And Tanya Saldier plays this girl named Kylie, whose family has a farm nearby where they're going to catch Grant, or the next farm where they think he's going to hit. And she's the one that catches the worm before it gets in her and kills it. Her family gets turned, but before we see her two younger sisters in bed, they're reading Goosebumps, Girl Who Cried Monster, and You Can't Scare Me. I thought that was cool. And yeah, from there it's your typical kind of small town zombie movie. Yeah, they all have the same a collective conscience, so it's almost like they're all Grant, but they all talk at the same time, which can be kind of creepy. Greg Henry as the mayor is the funniest character in the whole movie because he's completely ignorant I mean, before, when they first see Rooker before he takes off and goes into hiding, he's like, he roars. It looks like something's coming out of his head. He's got like a long arm that he whips. And Greg Henry says, like, probably got Lyme disease or something. They're like, Lyme disease? He's like, yeah, you touch some deer feces, you eat a sandwich, you got your Lyme disease. Or after they see the blueberry woman explode with the slugs, and it gets a couple of them, which all, and when you're a zombie, you can spit acid, kind of like Alien. Well, an alien is their blood, but still, it's like acid. Someone's like, oh, thank Jesus. He's like, thank Jesus. That's fucking pushing it. And then his meltdown over there being no Mr. Pibb in the cop car. And just, he's the funniest character. Now, I'm sure one thing that will probably turn a lot of people off is the amount of CGI. Yes, there is a lot of practical effects, especially on Grant in his final form, which I think was actually on the cover of an issue of Fangoria, if I'm not mistaken. But, like, you know, when he has the two tentacles coming out of his chest, that's CGI. All the slugs are CGI. When the big round blueberry woman is being ripped in half, that's CGI. The climax at the end with the explosion is CGI. Yeah, there is a lot of CG. And I've always been more lenient on CG when something is more fantastic or supernatural, like Aliens. But one reason why I forgive it a little more in this is also because where this is a throwback, namely the 80s, but it's a throwback to 80s films that are remakes or throwbacks to cheesy B 50s horror sci-fi movies. It might have looked good at the time, but looking now, I think that dated, cheesy look of the CGI kind of helps the effect of it being a throwback to the 80s. That's a throwback to the 50s. I think it just kind of fits more. It kind of goes along with the tone and the attempt to feel more like a movie from those periods. Have effects that look fake, I guess. But the practical effects are all awesome. And there is one gag that I can't really tell. It looks like a nice mixture of both CGI and practical. Ben Cotton, who I mentioned recently in the slasher film Scar with Angela Bettis. Their first ambush, or their first, trying to catch Grant when he's all mutated. Ben Cotton comes out and he's just like, we got to find out where you put that girl. Now come, you can make this easy or you can make this hard. And you get a far away shot of one of his tentacles just like, and it looks like it just whips his hat off his head. But then we see up close, we just see like a thin red line getting bigger and bigger until we get like a upward angle shot of his whole body, and he just kind of opens down the middle, and all his intestines come out, and he just falls back. I think the split was CGI, and the intestines falling out was practical, but it was a good blend of both. The look of Grant, I mean, which also, the zombies can just walk up to this huge blobby mass that Grant has become and just like start lay on top of them, and then their skin will just like fuse and become part of the mass. It does look a lot like the end orgy in Society, which is a very fun movie. I love Society. I believe that's Stuart Gordon too. If not, it's the one that Because I always get them mixed up. There's the writer and or producer of Reanimator, and then the director. Then they both went on to make similar films. But yeah, the way these naked zombies just come up and become infused and just part of this mass. And they're the ones that all start talking for Grant because Grant can just roar at this point. It is kind of like a society, but like one side of his mouth is normal, and then the other side is like this big like Glasgow grin with sharp teeth. Uh, and basically we just see all these townspeople turn into zombies, and at one point Greg Henry gets this huge growth because a worm got to him. He's like, "Kill me, Party." When Bill Party is Nathan Fillion. And I mean, basically all I'd be doing is just sharing what parts I thought were the funniest. I don't really want to do that, but this movie is as consistently funny as it is gross out body horror, or you know, there are some parts that are tragic because there is no going back for Grant, and there's even parts where we see tears rolling because uh, Elizabeth Banks is talking to him and trying to get him to stop and calm down. You can actually see the human come out at him. I do really like the sequence of the girl Kylie, the one that's able to get the worm out, and her family turns on her, where she gets out in the truck, and at first just all the slugs start engulfing the truck, and it's a shot of inside, and we see her hiding, but we see the shadows on the windshield just start to like cover her up, and then it just goes to black. And then her family's just banging on the windows afterwards. I I thought that was a nice sequence. I like the shot of just the shadows of the slugs just engulfing this truck. And for some reason, there's hatred for Pam Beesly on The Office. I love The Office. I never I don't know if it's just cool to hate Pam or what. But if you want to see her turn into a zombie, she has a quick scene. Pretty much doing the same accent she did in Walk Hard. And they're able to stop Grant because, there's a propane tank that's, shooting propane out. And Nathan Fillion has one of the tentacles in him, and he's fighting with the other one. He's able to puncture the tank with it. We see Grant's mask start filling up, and he has Elizabeth Banks shoot him, and he explodes. The explosion is CGI, but if this was a slasher film or like a torture film, then I would complain about the CGI. But where it's an alien film, I mean, it's still horror, but where the horror and the monsters, the creatures are aliens, something supernatural, I always find myself forgiving it more. And I mean, the real gory, gross out stuff is practical, so I'm thankful for that, especially how Grant looks at the end of the film. But again, I think the CGI does help with the illusion and just the sort of the state you're supposed to be in of feeling like a film from the 80s and ones from the 80s that are meant to be like ones from the 50s. So I think just those dated, cheesy effects helps that illusion out more. Other than that, there's just some other like one-liners. Like I think it's, is it Kill Whitney Dead that has the sample of the old guy in this? The first time we see Grant when he's all mutated, he's like, "That looks like something that fell off my dick during the war." Or like Grant saying that his condition is just a bee sting, and this one guy that looks just as bad, he's just like, poison oak. It does have a bunch of good jokes in it. Again, Greg Henry is the funniest character. There's this one recurring character, I don't know her name, but we see her at a bar doing karaoke, and she's singing the crying game, but she's singing it like, I know everything there is to know about the crying game. Like, just terrified looking. And even the acting, like the. Normally, I'm not big on accents, but I thought the accents sounded natural. The acting did feel like sort of classic acting. It did feel like they were acting in a movie from either the 50s or the 80s. Maybe not over the top as the 50s, but I've always found this to be a fun movie. It it is a very fun horror comedy. Again, not comedy horror, but I I would say it's as good as say something like Return of the Living Dead or Reanimator or Evil Dead 2, but it's still highly entertaining. And like I said earlier, I think Teeth is more funny, or I think more of the comedy in Teeth comes from how it's supposed to feel, like an older movie, like with the suspense music or reactions or something like that. Some of the acting, whereas this has flat out gags and jokes. But I the only thing I didn't really find funny, I guess, would be when Pam, who plays Nathan Fillion's secretary, is saying like over the radio, "Oh, your mom called. Toilet's backed up again." Okay, great, great. She said it's what you did on Sunday that's backed up. Why it's backed up. Of course, Elizabeth Banks is there, and he's had a crush on her, on Elizabeth Banks forever, and he's always kind of been jealous of Grant. But of course, they get together by the end of the movie. And I'm not sure what else to say about it. I mean, the CGI doesn't bother me. I think it serves a purpose. I do love those horror films or sci-fi horror, because I'm not the biggest sci-fi guy, but you blend it with horror, obviously I'm going to be more apt to like it. But some of my favorite sci-fi horror, aside from like zombie films, are the ones about a small rural town being overtaken by something. And I do think this is a more comedic version of something like uh, The Blob from 1988, or something like that. And I've always enjoyed this film. I think it's funny. It has a great cast. Has good, similar how the music was in Teeth. Good, like suspenseful, dramatic horror movie music, but the way it's used is kind of over the top. It kind of adds to the tone and kind of the silliness. But yeah, I'm just gonna start repeating myself. So, Slither from 2006. It's a shame it bombed because this is a very fun and entertaining movie. I'm glad it has the cult respect that it has now. But yeah, that is Slither from 2006. Thank you for watching.